Jethro Tull and some of the, I should say two of the most popular of his tunes, Teacher and Locomotive Breath from Aqualung. Ian, that's a question that's been on my mind for a long time. You know, the early albums, This Was, Benefit, Stand Up, were one kind of Jethro Tull music, and then you went on to Aqualung and your other concept albums. Is that your illustration of the metamorphosis of the musician, of having to consistently grow and create?
Well, it's an illustration of sorts. It's not as good as an illustration as I would wish it to have been. You know, retrospectively, the progress of the albums we've made has not been, from my point of view, as good as it might. But, you know, one continues to try to change a little with each album, to try to grow in some musical way. But the problem that faces any writer or performer is to accommodate his leanings towards more adventurous music forms within the musical framework for which he is widely known publicly. I mean, by that, it would be unfair of me to go out and do an album of music with a symphony orchestra, perhaps with me playing the flute or something, and then sell that under the name Jethro Tull. I mean, it's something that I would like to do. Yes. And it's in fact something I have done as an experiment, but I would never sell that record. I would never attempt to say, this is Jethro Tull, this is an album.
I see.
I mean, I've made that music. It's been very expensive as an experiment.
You're talking about Passion Play?
No. It was some music I recorded and did in London, privately with an orchestra. But it was for my own musical purposes. It would be unfair for me to trade on the name Jethro Tull and attempt to sell that publicly. You know, that is too a radical sort of experiment to make, but one tries to consistently make changes whilst keeping one foot in the old camp, as it were, because when you have this reputation, you find people coming to see you, they obviously want to hear old songs, and indeed we as a group enjoy playing many of those old songs, but we must insist upon the right to keep, another foot outside that camp and keep shuffling awkwardly in different directions. It's very necessary. It's the combination of those two approaches, remaining true to your own origins musically, whilst at the same time trying to delicately ahead.
Some people felt that Passion Play was too radical, that they didn't receive it as readily or as enthusiastically, for instance, as Aqualung or this album. When you look back on it now, do you feel that you moved ahead too quickly when Passion Play was released? Or do you feel that it should have been a proper progression?
Not really a question of moving ahead. You see, the music contained in Passion Play wasn't particularly radical in terms of Jethro Tull's musical style.
No,
it embodied a lot of...
The concept was.
Yes, well, we'll come to that. I mean, the actual music embodied most of the content that we'd previously achieved. It was nothing startlingly new. It was just the format of being a continuous piece of music and running at a fairly intense level for 40 minutes that made it less accessible, shall we say, to the average listener, and certainly less accessible to those people within the media systems who helped to make that available to the public. I mean, it's hard to find a place to drop the needle into the record, know. So it's a more difficult album to get into, but I think in terms of the music it's not particularly complex. It's just the format in which it was presented. And also because all 5 members of the group, in both Thick as a Brick and Passion Play, were involved in the process of arranging the music, actually making it into its finished form. And therefore it was a very intense sort of equality that existed in the group at that time, rather than in the situation before and since then, where I had rather more control than the other members of the group. So, I mean, in a way, I'm passing the buck and saying, don't blame me if you don't like those 2 records, because they were very much all the members of the group sort of involved as well. It's not.
I don't think there's anyone that could say really they didn't like them. I think they found them more difficult to understand, and most people are frightened by something that they can't understand readily. Jethro Tull from the current album, Too Young to Rock and Roll. Oh, rather too old to rock and roll, too young to die. Oh, it gets me every time I have to say it. Ian, if you had to categorize the shape of music today, honestly, how do you feel about it?
You're talking about the rock idiom?
Yes.
Well, I would say it's a very youthful, naive, experimental sort of an affair, but it's rather like anything that's become a giant it's run away with its own concept of freedom. It has now become limited because of the machinery that it's inadvertently set into motion. It is a corporate identity now, rock music. It is a very capitalistic and a very entrepreneurial affair. And it is the job of people like me, and perhaps the job of people like you, or at least some of us, have to constantly try to upset that apple cart, you know, because A, there are too many apples in the cart, and B, it's a lumbering piece of machinery that has gone out of control. You know, it is too all-powerful. You know, it embodies too much of mediocrity, I think. You know, it's reduced music to the level where it has mass appeal, clearly, but doesn't allow for the individual to perhaps exert that rebellious spark of something special. Very often there are few record companies who encourage groups to be different, or to deal in the kind of songs that are questioning the system. You see, it's a difficult situation. I mean, I don't look down on rock and roll or the system as being a bad thing, but I think it's very necessary that there are musicians and artists capable of occasionally pointing accusing fingers at the machinery of rock music.
Ian, one of the things that I'm concerned about is the ability of the new artist to be innovative. Now, you, of course, are established, you're revered, you have a prestige, so that if you come along with something quite radical, as you did with your concept albums, they're accepted. They have to be. But what about the new artist? It seems to me that the artists are being stifled by the system.
Yes, but I think they do an awful lot to stifle themselves by bowing down to the need for commerciality. You know, they don't fight as hard as
they should,
as perhaps some of the more established groups had to fight in the beginning. I mean, if you got a Bruce Springsteen yesterday,
today's on the cover of Time.
The heavy hype tomorrow. You know, as soon as he looks like being a potential winner, he is catapulted to the top overnight, you know, as being a great money spinner, you know, for a corporate identity. I'm not, you know, saying that's necessarily a bad thing, but it's a dangerous thing. And, you know, we must allow people to develop more slowly in a real way of playing concerts. We should have more small clubs. The audience should be willing to attend other than the big rock concerts. They shouldn't come to see me in concert. They should be going out to bars and, you know, small theatres and listening to groups that don't have very good audiences, because some of those groups are going to be the big groups of tomorrow. I mean, I'm cutting my own throat in this, but I honestly believe that if people, rather than coming to see me or the Zeppelins and the Elton Johns in concert, you know, stayed at home with a guitar, I would be honestly very pleased for them, because I think they would then experience something more like the joy that we as musicians experience playing the music on stage.
Well, I think there's room for both, don't you?
Well, one would hope there is room for both, but I think people are too willing to be an audience and not sufficiently willing to get more realistically close to music by attempting to do it on an amateur level themselves. One would wish for that to happen. That would also be a great catalytic sort of agent in renewing rock music. If we have to continue calling it rock music, I wish we could think of another title, you know.
I wish we could too.